They called it the Widowmaker, a 28-mile stretch where even the toughest Southern Pacific engines were torn apart by the mountain, leaving behind shattered metal, exploded boilers, and a death toll that nearly bankrupted the line. For over 3 decades, every accepted rule of locomotive design failed here. But when one backwards idea was dismissed and mocked, it answered a problem that killed 23 engines and 17 men. What makes a design everyone ridiculed become the safest in railroad history, and what price was paid for breaking with tradition? This is how the deadliest grade in America forced engineers to risk everything. Numbers told a story the mountain never stopped riding. On the Tehachapi Grade, 28 miles of unbroken climb wore down even the most advanced steam engines of their day. The grade itself stood at 2.2%, just steep enough to turn a routine haul into a daily gamble. Every curve, every tunnel multiplied the risk. In company accident ledgers, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Year after year, engines failed under strain. Boilers split open, drive wheels shattered, and cars piled up behind them. While exact figures remain elusive, the Southern Pacific's own records show a relentless drain on resources and morale. Freight delays stacked up, insurance costs rose, and maintenance crews struggled to keep up with the constant repairs. The financial toll was staggering. By the early 1900s, Southern Pacific's accountants estimated losses in the millions. Money poured into replacing lost engines, compensating families, and patching up battered track. Each incident carried a human cost as well. Crews faced the very real threat of boiler explosions, a danger that could end a life in seconds. Every time a locomotive failed on the grade, it wasn't just metal and machinery lost. It was the trust of the men who worked these trains, and the confidence of a company that depended on this route to keep California's markets connected. The grade's reputation spread across the West. For trainmen, Tehachapi was a proving ground where experience meant survival and every run could be the last. The numbers in the ledgers, losses, repairs, injuries, became a silent warning. Here, the rules of railroad engineering bent under pressure, and the cost of error was paid in steel and blood. For decades, no design could tame the grade. The challenge remained, waiting for someone willing to risk a new answer. Steam locomotives were built for flat ground, but Tehachapi's grade exposed a flaw that no engineer could ignore. The heart of every locomotive was its boiler, a steel cylinder filled with water, heated by a roaring firebox. On level track, gravity kept the water evenly spread, always covering the firebox's crown sheet, the thin metal plate above the flames. This was the most vulnerable part of the entire engine. If the crown sheet lost its water cover for even a minute, it could overheat, weaken, and rupture under pressure. The result wasn't just a breakdown. It was an explosion powerful enough to tear apart the locomotive and anyone inside. Climbing a grade like Tehachapi's, the entire locomotive tipped backward. Water, obeying gravity, sloshed away from the firebox. As the angle increased, the rear of the boiler, the firebox end, rose higher, and the water level inside dropped lower over the crown sheet. Engineers watched their water gauges with white-knuckle intensity, knowing that a few inches of exposed metal could spell disaster. The steeper the climb, the greater the gradient. On a 2.2% incline, calculations showed that up to a third of the firebox crown could be left dry, directly exposed to the fire's full fury. The risk was palpable. The problem wasn't just theoretical. On long, steady grades, the water pumps struggled to keep up with the engine's thirst. Any misjudgment or mechanical hiccup could drop the water line below safe limits. The boiler's pressure, often over 200 psi, meant there was no margin for error. In the cab, the crew relied on sight glasses and instinct, but the laws of physics were unforgiving. Every foot of climb increased the odds that the crown sheet would overheat, warp, or burst. The aftermath was always the same: twisted iron, shattered glass, and a ruined locomotive. This was the dilemma facing every railroad company operating through mountain country. Conventional designs simply weren't built for grades that stretched for miles. The danger was baked into the geometry of the locomotive itself. To survive Tehachapi, something fundamental had to change, not just in materials or maintenance, but in the very way engineers thought about the relationship between water, fire, and gravity. Engineers across the rail industry wasted no time tearing into the cab-forward proposal. In trade journals and company meetings, the design became an instant punchline. The most common accusation was simple: putting the crew in front of the boiler would turn the cab into an oven. Calculations circulated claiming temperatures could soar past 180 degrees Fahrenheit, making it impossible for anyone to survive a full shift. Others pointed to the risk of carbon monoxide. With the smokestack now behind the cab, critics warned that every tunnel would fill the crew compartment with invisible, deadly gas. Some said it would take only half an hour before a crew collapsed from fumes. Safety officers raised another alarm. Placing the cab at the very front meant that, in a collision, the crew would hit whatever was coming first, with no heavy boiler to shield them. Railroad veterans called it a crush zone, and muttered that anyone riding up front might as well pick out a coffin. The entire idea, they insisted, flew in the face of 70 years of proven locomotive practice. The ridicule didn't stop at technical journals. At a 1909 industry convention, one speaker used the cab forward as a joke about backwards thinking, drawing laughs from a packed hall. Newspapers ran editorials poking fun at the design, with one quipping that Southern Pacifics had built a locomotive while looking in a mirror. Rival engineers piled on, some refusing even to inspect the blueprints, convinced the whole thing was a publicity stunt or worse, a death trap. "I'd sooner ride in a pine box," one was quoted. "At least then I'd already be dead when the boiler let go." Even among Southern Pacific's own staff, skepticism was everywhere. Internal memos questioned whether the boiler would behave any differently just because the cab had moved. Calculations proved the crown sheet would still be at risk on a grade. The overwhelming opinion was clear. This was not just a bad idea, it was an act of desperation. Yet with the company losing money and no other solution in sight, the proposal was impossible to ignore. The challenge now was not just to build a new kind of locomotive, but to prove that every expert in the field could be wrong. Inside the Sacramento locomotive shops, work began under a veil of secrecy. Southern Pacific's engineering team, determined to outpace both skepticism and failure, assigned their best mechanics to the project. The prototype, designated AC-1, was unlike anything to roll out of the workshops before. Instead of coal, the design called for oil-fired burners, a decision that sidestepped the choking clouds that filled tunnels and made it possible to run the cab at the front. The cab itself was insulated, with thick layers built into the walls and roof, and new ventilation ducts threaded through steel panels to keep the crew shielded from both cold mountain air and the heat of the boiler behind them. Sight glasses and gauges, normally clustered at the rear, were moved forward, giving the engineer a direct view of water levels and pressure from the very front of the machine. The project demanded volunteers. Most crews wanted nothing to do with a locomotive that ran counter to every instinct and tradition. But one engineer stepped forward, a veteran of mountain grades, known for a steady hand and a willingness to take risks others avoided. He and his firemen signed on, knowing they would be the first to trust their lives to the new arrangement. In the days before the scheduled run, the stakes weighed heavily on the shop floor. Whispered doubts circled the workbenches, and every bolt tightened carried the pressure of the company's future on this route. Construction moved quickly but cautiously. Oil tanks and feed lines were tested for leaks, and the new cab's insulation was checked for gaps that could let in heat or fumes. Safety attention went to the placement of the water sight glasses. On a steep grade, a few inches of miscalculation could mean disaster. The crew spent hours in the cab, rehearsing emergency procedures and memorizing the new layout. Each checklist item ticked off was a small step against the fear that had haunted the grade for decades. When the AC-1 finally rolled out onto the tracks, the men who built it watched in silence. Months of clandestine work, design debates, and personal risk had brought them to this moment. The locomotive waited at the base of the mountain, its oil tanks full, cabs sealed against the elements, and every gauge gleaming under the shop lights. The prototype stood ready, not as a theory, but as a machine prepared to prove, once and for all, whether a backwards design could rewrite the rules of mountain railroading. Throttle opened, the prototype cab forward began its climb with 3,200 tons of freight straining behind. Onlookers, railroad officials, skeptical engineers, and a few press watched from the embankment as the locomotive inched past the yard limit. Inside the cab, the engineer kept his hand steady on the controls, eyes flicking between the forward water sight glass and the track ahead. Early predictions had painted a nightmare. Unbearable heat, choking fumes, a crew cooked alive. Instead, 5 minutes in, the thermometer on the cab wall read 78 degrees Fahrenheit, cooler than anyone expected, even for a spring morning on the mountain. The air was clean, with not a trace of smoke inside the cab. Oil firing and carefully designed ventilation kept the heat and exhaust trailing far behind. The crowd waited for disaster at every curve. Instead, the locomotive moved smoothly, the only sound the rhythmic exhaust and the low murmur of wheels on rail. At mile 8, the train passed the battered remains of an older engine, wreckage from a previous failure, left as a warning. The new locomotive rolled by without hesitation, boiler pressure steady, water levels right where they should be. Observers exchanged glances, some scribbling notes, others silent, watching for any sign of trouble that never came. The engineer sent word back. The climb was steady, the crew comfortable, and every gauge in the green. For the first time in years, the grade wasn't fighting back. The skepticism in the crowd began to give way to something else. Quiet, growing hope. The real test waited beyond mile 8. The grade sharpened, curves tightened, and the locomotive pressed into the section where most failures had claimed their victims. At mile 12, the engineer checked the water sight glass, expecting trouble, finding none. The firebox sat deep in water, fully submerged, defying decades of warnings about crown sheets running dry on a climb. Every calculation that had predicted disaster was quietly undone by the numbers on the gauge. The climb grew steeper. By mile 14, the locomotive was still accelerating, pushing uphill at 18 miles per hour, more than double the pace of any conventional engine that had survived this far. The cab, instead of turning into a furnace, held steady at a comfortable temperature. Crew hands stayed dry, faces calm. The ventilation system and oil firing kept air clear, heat trailing harmlessly behind. At mile 16, the train passed the spot where the most recent boiler failure had occurred just a year before. The engineer glanced at the thermometer, 82 degrees Fahrenheit. No sweat, no smoke, no hint of the lethal conditions that had haunted this stretch for decades. The telegraph key clicked out a message. Cab temperature steady, crew comfortable, visibility perfect. The mountain, so often the enemy, was losing its grip. 3 hours and 47 minutes after leaving the base, the locomotive crested the summit at mile 28. The climb was over. The crowd at the top grew as word spread, railroad officials, engineers, even skeptics who had come to witness a failure. One official, overwhelmed, fainted on the spot. The engineer stepped down, shook hands with the builders, and declared he would never return to a conventional cab. Against every prediction, the backwards locomotive had conquered the grade that once broke the best engines in the West. Southern Pacific's decision came faster than anyone expected. Within days of the successful climb, the company placed an immediate order for 15 additional cab-forward locomotives, all built to the same radical specifications as the prototype. The message was clear. This was no longer an experiment. In the first year alone, records show 256 freight runs over Tehachapi using the new design. Not a single failure was logged. Crews who had once refused to even inspect the cab forward now lined up to request assignments. The old routine, nursing overheated engines, sweating through smoke-filled cabs, bracing for the next breakdown, was replaced by a steady rhythm of reliable, uneventful trips. The numbers on Southern Pacific's balance sheets told their own story. Average cab temperatures for the new engines settled at a comfortable 85 degrees Fahrenheit, a sharp contrast to the stifling 125 degrees common in conventional locomotives. Where the company had once struggled to move freight over the pass, capacity tripled almost overnight. Trains that used to take 2 days to cross the mountains now made the journey in just 14 hours. For the first time in decades, the death rate on the grade dropped to 0. Southern Pacific's annual freight revenue jumped by more than $4 million, a figure that caught the attention of railroad executives across the country. Within months, the cab forward was no longer a curiosity. It was Southern Pacific's answer to the mountain, a machine that turned a company's near defeat into a system-wide transformation. The days of watching the mountain claim engine after engine were over. The cab forward had changed the rules, and the rest of the industry was taking notice. By the mid-20th century, the cab-forward locomotive was no longer an experiment. It was the backbone of mountain railroading in the American West. Southern Pacific's fleet grew to 256 cab-forwards, the largest collection of any single locomotive type ever operated by a U.S. railroad. These engines became the standard bearers on the toughest grades: Tehachapi, Donner Pass, the Siskiyou Mountains, and the Cascades. For nearly 5 decades, they carried the weight of California's economy over terrain that had humbled every previous design. The numbers behind their legacy are as striking as the engines themselves. From 1910 to 1958, 256 cab forwards ran tens of thousands of trips across the mountains. Only 3 crew deaths from boiler explosions were recorded in all those years, and none were caused by the design itself. For engineers and firemen, the cab forward was more than just a safer machine. It was a ticket to the most sought-after assignments on the railroad. Crews who once eyed the front cab with suspicion now waited years for a chance to run these engines. The work was demanding, but the reward was clear: comfort, safety, and the respect that came with mastering the mountains. Recognition followed long after the last steam whistle faded. In 1999, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers named the Southern Pacific cab forward a historic mechanical engineering landmark, honoring a design that had once been dismissed as madness. Today, only one of these giants survives: AC9, number 4294, preserved at the California State Railroad Museum. It stands as a monument to the men who built them, the crews who trusted them, and the idea that sometimes the answer to an old problem looks nothing like what came before. Engineer Bill Haley, who spent more than 30 years at the throttle of a cab forward, once summed up the feeling. They told us we would die in these machines. Instead, we lived longer, worked safer, and moved the West into the modern age. Today, railroad safety standards and innovation still face resistance from tradition and groupthink. The cab forward's legacy is a reminder. Progress often looks wrong before it looks obvious. As new technologies challenge our assumptions, The stakes are real. Lives and futures depend on questioning what everyone knows. Sometimes the boldest solutions only seem backwards until they become the path forward. Share your thoughts below.